Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest, strictest and most fascinating sisterhoods of the ancient world, the Vestal Virgins of Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we get into the vows, punishments, and astonishing lack of workplace benefits, we need to understand what the Vestal Virgins actually were. Because in ancient Rome, a place where people solved problems by sacrificing goats, consulting birds, or stabbing Caesar, the Vestals were considered the city's emotional support priestesses. If they were calm, Rome was calm. If they messed up, everyone instantly panicked as if Jupiter himself had filed a complaint. This wasn't just a religious order. It was Rome's most elite institution, run on the powerful combination of superstition, patriarchy, and theatrical fear. The Vestals weren't chosen because they wanted the job. They were chosen because Rome believed 6 small girls could hold the empire together better than the Senate ever did. And honestly, history proves they weren't wrong. The Vestals lived in the House of the Vestals, a gorgeous marble villa next to the Roman Forum. Think luxury estate, but with the constant threat of divine punishment. It had fountains, private gardens, elegant columns, basically the ancient world's version of a wellness retreat, except instead of yoga, you maintained an eternal flame that could never go out unless you enjoyed being publicly blamed for every bad harvest within a 50-mile radius. Their job was symbolic. Their presence was symbolic. Their purity was symbolic. Everything about them screamed, "Look at us, the gods still like Rome." They were walking billboards for divine approval. If a Vestal tripped in public, half the city interpreted it as a warning from the heavens, and the other half blamed the nearest politician. You would think the safety of an empire wouldn't hinge on a teenage girl's ability to walk in sandals. And yet, here we are. Despite the pressure, Vestals had privileges no other Roman woman enjoyed. They could own property. They had front-row seats at events. They didn't need a man's permission to exist, which in Rome practically made them superheroes. Touch a Vestal on your way to execution and boom, instant pardon. Absolutely wild power move. But beneath the marble, the gowns, and the divine PR, these girls were symbols Rome both worshipped and feared. They were revered when things went well and blamed when things went wrong. Basically, the ancient world's version of customer service representatives. So before we get into their rules, duties, and catastrophes, remember this. The Vestal Virgins weren't just Rome's priestesses. They were Rome's anxiety medication, and Rome was always stressed. Becoming a Vestal Virgin wasn't something a girl chose. It wasn't a calling, a vocation, or a passionate career goal like becoming a gladiator influencer or a professional grape stomper. No, it was a state-sponsored kidnapping wrapped in religious ceremony. Rome called it captio, meaning the seizure, which is possibly the most honest name the Romans ever came up with. Imagine being a 6-year-old girl in a nice patrician household, playing with wax dolls, when suddenly the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of Rome, shows up at your door with a group of men and says, "Congratulations, the gods want your daughter. No returns, no exchanges." The selection criteria were delightfully superficial. The girl had to be. From a noble family, physically flawless, Rome loved judging children, mentally sharp enough to obey commands, and soft-spoken enough not to start a rebellion. If she stuttered, limped, or had a single freckle that looked suspiciously like a bad omen, she was out. If she looked calm, quiet, and extremely kidnappable, jackpot. When a girl was chosen, her father didn't get to negotiate, bargain, or pretend he lost the child behind the market stalls. The state simply took her. Rome loved calling it an honor, but let's be real. Congratulations, your daughter will now serve the gods for 30 years, and may be buried alive if she slips up, is not the kind of news parents framed on the wall. The moment of selection was a spectacle. The Pontifex Maximus touched the girl and declared, "Te amata capio." I seize you, beloved. It's somehow sweet and horrifying at the same time, like being handed a cupcake with a spider in it. Then came the procession. The child was walked through the forum, past crowds pretending to be awestruck instead of mildly relieved their daughter wasn't chosen. People whispered blessings while secretly thanking every deity available that their own kids had dodged the divine draft. The girl entered the temple of Vesta, where the ritual haircut awaited. Her hair, symbolizing her previous life, was cut off and buried, probably next to the remains of her social freedom. From that moment on, she was no longer a normal child. She belonged to the gods, the state, and a long list of terrifying expectations. Rome called this the greatest honor. The children probably called it something else, quietly, in their heads, because speaking out was definitely not allowed. Once a girl was officially seized into service, the next stage was simple. She left her family forever. No weekend visits, no holidays, no "Mom, can you pick me up?" messages. The Vestals were Rome's most sacred employees, and Rome believed sacred employees work best when completely isolated from any support system. The moment a girl crossed the threshold of the Temple of Vesta, her old identity evaporated faster than a senator's moral integrity. She was now a daughter of the state. Which sounds noble, until you remember Rome's parenting style involved a lot of yelling, superstition, and public punishment. The ceremony itself was dramatic. She walked alongside the Pontifex Maximus, surrounded by priests, musicians, and enough incense to smoke out half the forum. Crowds gathered not because they cared, but because ancient Rome treated every event like a spectator sport. Oh look, little Julia got chosen. Good for her. And also, thank the gods it's not my child. Once inside, the first order of business was a ritual haircut. Her long childhood hair was chopped off and then buried like a fallen hero. This symbolized her severing from the mortal world, dramatic but very on brand for Rome, a city that loved symbolism almost as much as it loved public executions. Then came the white veil, the plain robes, the new name, all reminders that she had transitioned into a sacred life. Rome basically rebranded her like a new product launch. New, improved, now with 100% more purity. The girl was then escorted into the House of the Vestals, a sprawling luxury complex that looked like a palace but functioned like a divine boarding school. It had fountains, kitchens, servants, gardens, and elegant bedrooms. Everything except freedom. Think Hogwarts. But everyone is in detention forever, and while it lavishly protected its virgins, the house also trapped them. Guards patrolled. Doors were watched. You were free to roam the gardens, the corridors, the courtyard, but not the actual city that existed 5 feet away. The message was clear. You have everything you need, except your previous life. Yet for many families, this was still considered a win. Their daughter was now untouchable, holy, and living better than most aristocrats. Parents bragged about it at dinner parties. "Oh yes, our daughter's a Vestal now. No big deal, just carrying the entire fate of the empire on her tiny shoulders." Leaving home was both a promotion and a life sentence. The Romans were excellent at designing things like that. Now that our newly minted holy child had been ceremonially disconnected from her old life, it was time to move her into her new home, the House of the Vestals. And let me tell you, this place was stunning. Marble floors, arched colonnades, sculpted fountains bubbling like a spa resort, flowering gardens, elegant statues, rooms big enough to hear your own anxiety echo. On paper, it was paradise. In reality, it was a 5-star gilded cage, run by priests who believed smiling too much could offend a goddess. Located right next to the Roman Forum, the house was perfectly positioned for maximum symbolism. The Vestals watched the heart of Rome, and Rome watched them back, constantly. Imagine living in a penthouse in Times Square, except your lease agreement is stay here or face divine punishment. Inside, the place was enormous. 3 stories of living quarters, cooking rooms, storage chambers, ceremonial spaces, and hallways so long they looked designed for dramatic pacing. The central courtyard held a beautiful pool and garden where Vestals could stroll gracefully while contemplating the weight of carrying Rome's destiny at age 8. Then again, even luxury loses its shine when you're not allowed to leave. Guards weren't standing at the doors, but the unspoken threat of breaking sacred rules was enough to make anyone behave. The Vestals technically had freedom inside, but stepping beyond the complex without permission. Not recommended unless you enjoyed disciplinary beatings administered with the kind of enthusiasm only ancient Romans could muster. Still, compared to the average Roman woman, who had the legal rights of a decorative vase, the Vestals lived like aristocrats. They ate the best food, wore fine garments, and had servants to assist them. Their rooms were clean, well lit, and blessedly rat-free, a luxury Rome rarely provided. But the flip side. You lived with constant surveillance, divine expectations, and the knowledge that one mistake could cause mass panic, a mandatory purification ceremony, and several senators yelling about portents again. Every sound, every gesture, every late-night sigh echoed through a building that wasn't just a house, it was a symbol, a political tool, a religious monument, a place where childhood dreams went to be pressed into service like olives crushed for oil. In this marble palace, the Vestals would spend decades learning to walk, speak, breathe, and exist with the level of calm usually reserved for statues. House of luxury? Yes. House of freedom? Absolutely not. The House of the Vestals was the ancient world's most beautiful reminder that comfort does not equal freedom. Once a young Vestal settled into her marble-scented prison of luxury, it was time for her main duty. The task Rome took more seriously than elections, omens, or the structural integrity of their bridges, keeping the eternal flame burning. This wasn't just any flame. It wasn't a decorative torch or a cozy hearth fire. This was Vesta's sacred fire, the spiritual Wi-Fi connection of ancient Rome. If it stayed lit, Rome prospered. If it went out, Rome believed chaos would erupt instantly. Crops failing, armies losing, politicians making even worse decisions than usual. Basically, all the things Rome blamed on the gods when they didn't want to blame themselves. For the Vestals, this meant one simple rule: do not let the fire die ever. They tended it day and night in shifts, like tiny divine firefighters who were also expected to be spotless, silent, and serene. Imagine the pressure. You're 8 years old, your sandals are too big, you're homesick, and you're responsible for preventing the fall of the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, your average adult Roman man couldn't even prevent the fall of his own toga. To maintain the flame, Vestals collected firewood, cleaned the hearth, and performed ritual offerings each day. They used sacred tools, sacred procedures, and probably sacred patience, considering they weren't allowed to roll their eyes even once. The whole process had to be done with reverence and grace, no rushing, no complaining, and definitely no puffing out the flame accidentally. And if the flame did go out, that was a catastrophe of divine proportions. The Vestal responsible would be whipped, gently, for religious reasons, according to the priests, though we all know Rome and gentle rarely occupied the same sentence. The city would perform emergency purification rituals, sacrificing animals, chanting prayers, and loudly wondering which god they'd offended this time. But here's the twist. The fire going out wasn't always the Vestal's fault. Sometimes storms blew through, sometimes wind caught the smoke wrong, sometimes the gods were just feeling dramatic. But Rome never blamed the gods. Oh no, Rome blamed the teenage girl with a broom and a job description longer than most senators' resumes. Still, despite the impossible stakes, the Vestals kept that flame alive for over 1,000 years. Through wars, plagues, coups, and whatever weirdness Caligula was doing that day, the flame endured, because 6 terrified priestesses were very, very motivated not to disappoint a goddess with a track record of fiery vengeance. Before a Vestal Virgin was trusted anywhere near the sacred flame, she had to survive 10 full years of training. a decade-long crash course in ritual precision, public perfection, and the fine art of not accidentally offending a goddess who could smite entire cities over missing grain offerings. These first 10 years were essentially priestess boot camp, except instead of push-ups and obstacle courses, the girls learned how to fold their robes correctly, memorize hundreds of ritual instructions, and stand still for long periods without scratching their nose. This might sound easy, but consider Roman religion. Everything had symbolism, everything had meaning, and everything had the potential to go disastrously wrong if you stepped 2 inches to the left. The curriculum included memorizing sacred chants without mispronouncing a single syllable, learning purification rituals that involved water, fire, smoke, grain, or occasionally all of them at once, understanding omens, because no one wants to misinterpret a crow landing on the wrong side of a statue, maintaining the sacred implements like brooms, knives, ladles, and whatever else the gods allegedly needed, how to keep your face neutral even when a senator starts ranting about comets again. Oh, and they also had to learn to read and write, a big deal, since Roman girls typically didn't get a formal education. While other girls were being married off or practicing spindle work, the Vestals were studying law, ritual text, and the kind of philosophical questions that only emerge when someone forces you to sit silently for hours next to a holy fire. They weren't isolated, though. Senior Vestals acted as teachers, mentors, and slightly terrifying role models. Imagine a strict nun crossed with a political advisor, crossed with someone who's been keeping a flame alive for 27 years on 4 hours of sleep. These women took their job seriously because they understood what was at stake. The pride of Rome, the wrath of Vesta, and of course, the possibility of being held responsible for disasters entirely outside their pay grade. Training was strict. Mistakes were corrected instantly. And if a girl showed too much giggling, too much daydreaming, or too much interest in literally anything outside the temple, she was gently reminded, through lectures, rituals, and the occasional ominous silence, that she was now living a sacred life trademark. And sacred lives do not include hobbies. By the end of the 10-year training, the girls weren't just prepared. They were conditioned, polished into the perfect blend of calm, precision, and existential fear. Ready or not, they were about to enter the next decade, full Vestal duty, where mistakes carried consequences, and success meant no one noticed you existed. After 10 long years of training, memorizing rituals, mastering sacred silence, and resisting every urge to roll their eyes at omens, a Vestal Virgin finally entered her second decade, the 10 years of full, official service. This was the era where everything counted. No more, "I'm new here." No more, "Oops, I forgot." This was the decade where mistakes triggered cosmic consequences, or at least very dramatic Roman overreactions. As full Vestals, these women didn't just tend the sacred flame. They became the spiritual multi-tool of ancient Rome. Their daily duties were endless, precise, and mildly exhausting. Feeding the eternal flame, the main event. They gathered the purest firewood, prepared ritual offerings, and tended Vesta's flame with the seriousness of someone defusing a bomb. One wrong move, and the entire city turned into a panicked Reddit thread. "Flame went out, Emma!" Ritual purification. Vestals prepared holy water, incense, salted flour, and other magical ingredients to keep Rome spiritually disinfected. If a single grain spilled the wrong way, priests would instantly assume the gods were furious, not at themselves, obviously, but at the nearest Vestal. Guarding the sacred objects, Rome kept its most important legal documents, wills, treaties, and political secrets, in the care of the Vestals. Because nothing says confidential like giving your private documents to a group of terrified virgins living under religious surveillance. Participating in public rituals. Vestals attended ceremonies, festivals, and sacrifices with perfect composure. Imagine watching a bull sacrifice up close while maintaining a serene expression, knowing that if you even flinched, someone would say the gods disapproved. Maintaining purity. Not just physical purity, symbolic purity. Their emotions, gestures, clothing, posture, breathing, and probably their thoughts had to be immaculate. If a Vestal looked sleepy, people whispered. If she sneezed during a ritual, entire temples panicked. Being Rome's walking good luck charms. If a Vestal touched a condemned prisoner on his way to execution, even accidentally, he was immediately pardoned. Imagine tripping in the forum and accidentally freeing a murderer. And through all this, they were expected to embody calm dignity. No slouching, no complaining, no, I'm tired of holding cosmic responsibility. Just the quiet understanding that they represented the stability of Rome, a city that was rarely stable. These 10 years were the peak of their power and the peak of their pressure. The Vestals were honoured, revered, and held to impossibly high standards, which is Roman code for, we trust you, but if anything goes wrong, it's definitely your fault. After 20 years of training, performing, panicking, not panicking, and maintaining a flame that absolutely refused to go out on its own, the Vestals entered their final decade, 10 years of teaching. This was the era when they transitioned from terrified apprentices to terrifying mentors, the ancient equivalent of a senior employee who has seen everything, survived everything, and now watches newcomers with the subtle judgment of a marble statue. Teaching wasn't optional. Once a Vestal reached her third decade, she became responsible for training the next generation of small, anxious recruits. This meant she now had to explain rituals she had once cried over, demonstrate techniques she had once messed up, and maintain the kind of serene authority only achieved through many years of standing perfectly still next to a fire. A senior Vestal's schedule included mentor duties. She guided the novices through complicated rituals, taught them the sacred chants, and supervised their daily chores. The goal: prevent the children from accidentally summoning divine wrath or knocking over anything important, which, in Rome, was everything. Enforcing rules. This was the era when she finally got to be the one giving ominous warnings like, do not run near the sacred flame. Do not touch that scroll, it's older than your ancestors. Do not breathe too loudly during purification rites. Somewhere deep down, she probably enjoyed this part. Correcting mistakes. Mistakes during training were normal, until a senior Vestal appeared behind you with that stare. You know the one, the look that says, I've kept this flame alive for 27 years, and I will not let you ruin my record. Teaching ritual mindfulness. Not the modern kind involving crystals and deep breathing, the ancient Roman kind, which meant memorizing 50 procedural steps while holding a grain offering at precisely shoulder height. Imparting survival tips. These weren't written anywhere, but every senior Vestal had a mental notebook full of wisdom like, never trust a priest who says this won't take long. If you hear thunder during a ceremony, pretend it's auspicious. If a senator asks if the gods are angry, the correct answer is always no. Passing on the fear above everything, senior Vestals taught the novices the sacred lesson every Vestal eventually learned. You are vital. You are honoured. And you are one badly timed sneeze away from an omen. By the end of this decade, a Vestal had completed her divine career. She had been student, servant, spiritual worker, and now teacher, a full circle forged in fire, discipline, and 30 years of absolutely no romantic scandals. For all the pressure, fear, and flame-tending terror, the Vestal Virgins enjoyed privileges that made the rest of Rome's women look like background characters in their own lives. Rome loved to say it honoured the Vestals, and for once the empire wasn't exaggerating. These priestesses lived better than most senators, and considerably better than the average Roman man who struggled daily with public baths, bad wine, and toga malfunctions. The power of the Vestals began the moment they stepped into the public eye. They moved through the streets with a dignity that even the highest magistrates respected. Ordinary women had to be accompanied by fathers, husbands, or whichever male relative hadn't wandered off yet. Vestals? They walked independently. In a society where women were legally closer to household furniture than citizens, the Vestals were practically superheroes. They were granted front row seats at games, an honour usually reserved for Rome's elite men. When a Vestal took her seat at the Colosseum or circus, crowds automatically quieted just a bit, because if a Vestal was present, the gods were watching too. The symbolism was powerful, and Rome adored symbolism almost as much as it adored public entertainment. Their influence wasn't just ceremonial. Vestals could pardon prisoners. If a condemned man on his way to execution happened to touch a Vestal, even accidentally, even if he tripped, he was instantly granted his freedom. Imagine having the power to save a life simply by existing in the wrong place at the right time. That's the kind of divine authority politicians could only dream of. They also enjoyed financial freedom. Vestals could own property, write wills, and manage their own wealth. While other women needed legal guardians for transactions as simple as buying a cup of wine, Vestals were signing contracts and acquiring estates like seasoned professionals. Rome treated them like legal adults while treating everyone else like confused toddlers. Even the law bowed to them. A Vestal's testimony in court carried extraordinary weight, not because she was infallible, but because Rome assumed the goddess Vesta herself guided her honesty. No pressure, of course, just the expectation that your every word echoed divine truth. Yet all this power came with an unmistakable edge. The Vestals were honoured because they were essential, and they were essential because Rome believed catastrophe lurked behind every corner. A Vestal's privilege was balanced by the knowledge that she was always one misinterpreted expression away from becoming an omen. They were revered, they were feared, and perhaps most importantly, they were watched. By the city, by the priests, and supposedly by Vesta herself. If there was one rule Rome cared about more than the sacred flame, it was the Vestal's chastity. The Romans treated this vow with the kind of seriousness normally reserved for declarations of war, or calculating the omens of a slightly confused chicken. A Vestal Virgin had to remain utterly, impeccably, profoundly pure for 30 years. Not because Rome cared about her personal morality, but because it believed her chastity was directly linked to the stability of the entire empire. Rome, unsurprisingly, never explained how one woman's love life could topple a civilization of 1 million people. But logic rarely slowed down Roman religion. The theory was simple. Vesta was the goddess of hearth, home, and the sacred flame. Her priestesses embodied her purity. If a Vestal broke her vow, that purity cracked, and Rome's metaphorical household collapsed. The city acted as if the Vestals were holding a cosmic Jenga tower together with sheer willpower and chastity alone. The expectations were merciless. Vestals were surrounded by guards, by rules, and by the ever-present suspicion that somewhere out there, a god was watching them with divine binoculars. They could walk freely in the city, yes, but freedom isn't freedom if people are scanning your face to detect even the faintest hint of romantic scandal. A Vestal could trip on the street, and half the forum would whisper, "She's in love," followed by immediate Senate discussions on possible omens. Roman men, of course, faced no equivalent vow. A senator could have 3 wives, 12 mistresses, and a suspicious number of household attendants, and nobody batted an eye. But if a Vestal so much as made meaningful eye contact with someone during a festival, the priests began sharpening their shovels. It was a double standard so blatant even ancient historians rolled their eyes. Maintaining chastity wasn't just about avoiding physical relationships. Vestals had to avoid situations that might look suspicious. A private conversation? Dangerous. A smile lasting half a second too long? Concerning. Standing too close to a handsome equestrian? Treasonous. The Vestals weren't just celibate. They were living symbols of purity, expected to float through life like divine statues who occasionally performed fire maintenance. And the worst part? There was no second chance. One accusation, founded or not, could destroy a career, a reputation, and quite literally, a life. Rome held the Vestals on a pedestal so high that the only direction left to fall was catastrophic. This was the paradox of being a Vestal Virgin. Absolute honour balanced on the edge of absolute ruin. If a Vestal Virgin broke her vow of chastity, Rome didn't treat it as a private matter, a personal mistake, or even a scandal. No, it became a full-blown cosmic crisis. Romans believed that the purity of a Vestal wasn't just symbolic, it was the city's spiritual life support system. So if a Vestal's vow shattered, the solution had to be equally dramatic. And because Rome never did anything halfway, they invented one of the most theatrical punishments in ancient history: burying her alive. Yes, alive. Because apparently the Romans took the phrase overreaction as divine instruction. But there was a twist. Rome prided itself on being civilized, which meant they could not legally execute a Vestal. She was, after all, a sacred woman belonging to the goddess Vesta. So they created a loophole so large and so morally questionable that even a Roman lawyer would squint at it. They placed the Vestal in an underground chamber, furnished with a bed, a lamp, water, and a small amount of food, and sealed her in. Technically, they weren't killing her. They were simply placing her somewhere she would eventually die on her own. Rome, always finding creative ways to justify its drama. The ritual began with a public trial. The accused Vestal stood before the Pontifex Maximus, usually trembling beneath layers of symbolic purity and sheer terror. The priests asked her a series of questions, not so much to seek truth, but to check a box on the ritual checklist. After all, once Rome smelled scandal, facts became optional. The accused Vestal could proclaim innocence until her voice broke, but Rome, in its superstitious frenzy, rarely cared. A bad harvest, a solar eclipse, or an unfortunate pigeon omen could doom her as easily as actual guilt. The procession to the execution site was a grim parade. The Vestal was placed in a closed litter so no one could see her, and no one could risk accidentally touching her. Heaven forbid a doomed priestess accidentally pardoned a criminal on the way to her grave. The people watched in silence because nothing warns a society to behave quite like watching its spiritual icons punished with geological enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the man involved, assuming he existed, was whipped to death in the Forum, a sentence Rome performed with disturbingly casual efficiency. In the end, the burial alive ritual revealed everything about Rome's relationship with the Vestals. They were essential, revered, and terrifyingly disposable the moment a superstition turned against them. If you think modern politics thrives on scandal, ancient Rome would like to raise you one Vestal Virgin. Nothing electrified the city quite like whispers that a Vestal had broken her vow. It didn't matter whether it was true, partly true, or invented by a senator having a slow news week. The mere hint of impropriety sent Rome spiralling into moral panic faster than you can say auspicious omens. The Vestals, unfortunately, lived in the most politically weaponizable position imaginable. They were at the intersection of religion, superstition, and public paranoia, a perfect storm for accusations. A Vestal didn't need to actually do anything wrong. She just needed to look slightly stressed during a ritual, or sneeze at the wrong moment, and half the Senate would interpret it as divine displeasure. The other half used it as an opportunity to ruin someone's career. Politicians loved Vestal scandals. They were the Swiss army knife of political tools, useful for distracting the public, eliminating rivals, or convincing everyone that Jupiter hated your opponents more than he hated you. If a powerful man wanted to bring down an enemy, accusing that enemy of seducing a Vestal was the ancient version of dropping a nuke. After all, who could argue with the gods? The public played along with shocking enthusiasm. Romans adored drama. If a Vestal was suspected of wrongdoing, crowds filled the Forum, whispering interpretations and inventing symptoms of divine anger. A slightly crooked lightning bolt? A bad harvest? A crow sitting on the wrong temple roof? Clearly the universe was sending hints, and clearly those hints pointed directly at the Vestal in question. The city turned into a live-action conspiracy forum. And the trials... Oh, the trials. They weren't trials so much as performance art. The accused Vestal stood there as priests recited rituals, senators delivered dramatic speeches, and the public stared with the intensity of people watching a gladiator match they didn't realize was actually about religion. Evidence was optional. Vibes were enough. If Rome felt unlucky that year, the Vestal was guilty. Even innocent Vestals weren't safe. Some were sacrificed to restore public confidence, others to satisfy political vendettas, and a few simply because Rome believed disasters couldn't possibly be random. Someone, preferably a woman with a spotless record, had to take the fall. In the end, Vestal scandals reminded everyone of Rome's deepest fear: chaos. And nothing soothed that fear quite like blaming a young woman who had dedicated her life to preventing chaos in the first place. For a civilization that prided itself on engineering, military strength, and the ability to conquer continents while wearing skirts, Rome could be astonishingly fragile when it came to one thing: the sacred flame going out. You would think a city with aqueducts, concrete, and a whole military-industrial complex would handle a simple fire mishap calmly. Absolutely not. The moment the eternal flame flickered into darkness, Rome reacted like someone had unplugged the god's life support machine. When the flame went out, and yes, it did happen, more often than the priests wanted to admit, the city plunged into instant spiritual crisis mode. People in the forum gasped dramatically, priests scrambled like chickens fleeing a thunderstorm, and senators immediately blamed foreign influence, political rivals, or the ominous shape of last night's clouds. Because in Rome, everything had meaning, even accidents. The Vestal responsible usually froze in horror, because she knew exactly what was coming next. A sudden, very public reminder that Romans did not believe in mistakes. Everyone had a theory about why the flame failed. Some blamed divine anger. Some blamed poor ritual execution. Some blamed the girl's posture, breathing, or aura. No one blamed the fact that maintaining a fire in an open-air temple during a windy Mediterranean night is frankly kind of difficult. The penalty for letting the flame die was a beating. Not a severe one, according to Roman priests, but Roman priests were not known for their gentle approach to discipline. This punishment was carried out in a darkened place, supposedly to preserve the Vestal's dignity. Of course, being whipped in a small dark room was hardly dignified, but at least Rome liked to pretend. Meanwhile, the rest of the city performed massive purification rituals to reboot the spiritual system. Animals were sacrificed, prayers were chanted, incense burned until half the forum smelled like a divine barbecue, and a new fire was lit using the purest means available, often sunlight focused through a magnifying glass-like device. Apparently the gods preferred solar energy. The whole ordeal was not just a religious emergency, it was a political performance. Rome needed to show the gods, and itself, that it was still in control. A relit flame meant hope. A punished Vestal meant accountability. A completed ritual meant stability had somehow been restored. But beneath the drama, everyone understood the truth. The Vestals were human. The flame was fickle. And Rome, for all its grandeur, could be undone by something as simple as a gust of wind. After 30 years of serving the gods, tending an anxiety-inducing flame, performing rituals with flawless precision, and living under the perpetual threat of burial, the Vestal Virgins reached a milestone that must have felt like divine salvation: retirement. The moment a Vestal completed her 3-decade service, she was finally free to rejoin the mortal world. A world she hadn't lived in since childhood, and was probably half convinced no longer existed. Retirement transformed a Vestal into something rare in Rome. A woman with complete legal independence. She could own property, make contracts, manage finances, buy land, sell land, sue people, and, most shockingly, live without a male guardian overseeing her every move. In a society where even wealthy matrons needed permission to sneeze in the general direction of a marketplace, former Vestals were walking anomalies of freedom. Many Romans sought retired Vestals for marriage, believing their purity and divine connection brought good fortune. After all, what better way to bless your household than marrying someone who had spent 30 years staring into a holy fire while maintaining perfect posture? Wealthy men lined up, hoping to secure a wife who symbolized cosmic approval, stable luck, and a reduced likelihood of household curses. But here's the twist. Most retired Vestals didn't marry. After decades of complete autonomy and spiritual authority, the idea of suddenly reporting to a husband must have sounded about as appealing as returning to the burial chamber they had narrowly avoided. Imagine being free after 30 years, and then immediately forfeiting your independence because Publius wants someone to manage his villa. No thanks. Those who did marry sometimes struggled to adjust. Life outside the house of the Vestals was noisy, unpredictable, and full of people who didn't understand basic ritual etiquette. Ordinary citizens made mistakes constantly, touching sacred objects incorrectly, ignoring omens, failing to maintain pure thoughts during festivals. A former Vestal might witness one household mishap and nearly perform a purification ceremony on instinct. Still, retirement had its joys. A former Vestal could walk the city without being watched like a divine barometer. She could enjoy festivals without worrying that her smile was being analysed for cosmic meaning. She could go to the market and buy a piece of fruit without considering its ritual symbolism. In short, she could live like a person, not a myth. Yet the public never fully let go of the aura surrounding retired Vestals. People still whispered blessings when they passed. Children stared in awe. Some citizens believed that even in retirement, a Vestal carried a spark of the sacred flame within her. And maybe she did. But now, at last, it was hers. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins stood at the centre of Rome's spiritual identity. Through civil wars, assassinations, plagues, imperial scandals, and emperors who really should have been supervised, the Vestals kept the flame burning. They were the quiet constant in a city that never stopped yelling. But everything in Rome, even the most sacred traditions, eventually collided with history's favourite hobby: change. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was shifting dramatically. Christianity was rising with the enthusiasm of a new startup backed by divine venture capital, and traditional Roman religion was steadily losing government funding. Old gods were out, new doctrines were in, and suddenly people looked at the eternal flame and said, "Do we actually need this?" A dangerous question in any era, but especially in Rome, where people once sacrificed animals because Mercury was having an off day. Then came Emperor Theodosius I, a man whose life mission seemed to be deleting Rome's pagan past like outdated files on a dusty divine computer. In 394 CE, he issued the decree that ended the Vestal Order. The Temple of Vesta, once the spiritual heartbeat of the city, fell silent. The sacred flame, which generations of terrified priestesses had protected with the dedication of overworked interns, was extinguished forever. The reaction was mixed. Traditionalists were horrified. Superstitious citizens waited nervously for earthquakes, plagues, or angry gods dropping thunderbolts on the forum. But the world didn't immediately collapse. Crops didn't fail. Volcanoes did not erupt in dramatic protest. To the surprise of many, life continued, and people slowly realized Rome wouldn't implode just because 6 women weren't standing guard over a sacred bonfire. But the symbolic impact was enormous. The extinguishing of the flame marked the end of Rome's ancient religious identity. The Vestals, once untouchable figures of purity and prestige, now found themselves relics of a fading world. Some were absorbed into aristocratic households, others quietly retired, and a few remained in Rome as living reminders of an age slipping away. The house of the Vestals fell into disuse, its elegant courtyard eventually filling with rubble and silence. Statues cracked, fountains dried. The marble halls that once echoed with whispered prayers and ritual footsteps turned into ruins, ironically preserved better than many Roman marriages. And perhaps that's the bittersweet truth. The Vestal Virgins didn't end because they failed. They ended because Rome changed. Their flame wasn't extinguished by catastrophe, scandal, or divine punishment. It was extinguished because the empire that created them had finally rewritten its identity. The last flicker of Vesta's fire faded into history, and with it, one of the most extraordinary sisterhoods the ancient world ever knew. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they usually picture battles, plagues, or towering castles. But beneath that rough, disciplined surface, medieval life pulsed with games, contests, and physical challenges that shaped identity just as much as faith or feudal duty. Play, in medieval understanding, was not a luxury. It was a social force, a way to maintain order, strengthen bodies, forge alliances, and measure courage in a world where strength and honour were currencies as real as silver. What made medieval games unique was how deeply they reflected class. A nobleman and a farmhand could both be athletic, yet their definitions of sport existed in entirely different worlds. For peasants, daily labour already demanded physical power. Farming, chopping wood, hauling water, and tending animals forged natural endurance. So when peasants gathered for play, they favoured rough, community-centred activities, wrestling in fields after the harvest, chasing each other in games that resembled tag, or kicking a crude leather ball around the village green. Their games were spontaneous, loud, and often chaotic, a welcome escape from work that rarely ended before sunset. Nobles, on the other hand, practiced sports that doubled as preparation for war. They fenced with blunted swords to sharpen reflexes, trained with lances to perfect their aim for tournaments, and practiced archery to strengthen the muscle groups needed on the battlefield. Their games had ceremony, banners fluttering in the courtyard, attendants watching, rules carefully preserved. A noble's play was a rehearsal for conflict, wrapped in silk and honour. Even relaxing games such as hunting or hawking were tied to status, requiring land, equipment, and trained animals only the elite could afford. Yet despite these differences, medieval society agreed on one thing. Games revealed character. To win through strength was admirable, but to win through cleverness, persistence, or courage was even better. This belief connected everything from a monk contemplating his next move in a chess game to a young squire mastering the longsword under his lord's watchful eye. Even the church, often strict, understood that play had value. Some monasteries permitted board games like early chess or Hanafatafel to sharpen strategic thinking. For villages and noble courts alike, games weren't just distractions. They were woven into the culture, shaping relationships, rank, and identity in a world defined by hierarchy and struggle. In the Middle Ages, archery wasn't just a pastime. It was both a survival skill and, in many societies, a legal duty. Across England especially, the bow became the great equaliser, a weapon that allowed commoners to shape the fate of kingdoms. Because of this, archery soon transformed into the most serious game of the lower and middle classes, blending sport, military training, and national identity. For peasants, archery meant food and protection. A skilled archer could bring home rabbits, birds, or even small deer, giving their family a priceless edge during harsh seasons. But archery was also a defence against danger, raiders, wolves, rival lords. The bow was affordable, and more importantly, it could be learned without noble lineage. This accessibility made it deeply woven into rural culture. On Sundays or feast days, villagers gathered in open fields to test their aim, wagering drinks, bread, or bragging rights. These competitions were lively, filled with laughter, teasing, and the clack of arrows hitting wooden targets. For kings, however, archery was a strategic necessity. English monarchs famously required all able-bodied men to practice on weekends and holidays. Laws were passed forbidding frivolous games like dice or football, commanding men to shoot instead. Monarchs knew that an army of trained archers, even poor ones, could decide battles. And they were right. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, ordinary archers humbled armoured knights and reshaped medieval warfare. The longbow was brutal to master. It required immense strength, with some bows pulling over 100 pounds. Archers trained not just their arms, but their entire upper bodies, backs, shoulders, and core, often developing distinctive asymmetrical muscles that skeletal remains still reveal today. Because of how physically demanding it was, competitions served as both sport and conditioning. To excel meant endurance, patience, and instincts sharpened by countless hours outdoors. Among nobles, archery had a different flavour. They practised with recurved bows for hunting or display, leaving the longbow's battlefield role largely to commoners. For them, the sport was tied to elegance, falconry displays, mounted archery, or precision shots during court festivals. Regardless of class, archery symbolized discipline and control. Each shot was a test of balance, breath, and calm. To draw a bow was to confront gravity, wind, and your own nerves. And for medieval people, sending an arrow cleanly into a target wasn't just victory. It was a reflection of character in a world where strength and skill meant survival. If archery showcased precision and discipline, wrestling revealed the raw, unfiltered power of medieval life. This was the sport of farmhands, mill workers, shepherd boys, and travellers, a test of muscle, balance, and stubborn determination. Wrestling required no equipment, no special training ground, and no noble title. All it needed was open space, 2 willing opponents, and a crowd eager for a contest that was as much social theatre as sport. In villages across Europe, wrestling matches were part of festivals, markets, and feast day celebrations. After long days of labour, men challenged each other to bouts that blended friendly rivalry with real physical struggle. Stakes varied. A jug of ale, a loaf of bread, a kiss from the girl handing out ribbons, or simply the honour of being the strong one in the village. These contests weren't completely lawless. Most followed unwritten rules, such as no striking, gouging, or biting. You won by throwing your opponent to the ground or forcing him into submission. Yet despite these limits, the matches could be fiercely competitive, leaving bruises, sprains, and sometimes broken bones. Because peasants lived physically demanding lives, their bodies became naturally conditioned for grappling. Wrestling was an outlet for tensions, a way to resolve disputes without escalating into serious violence. A man insulted at the tavern might say, "Come outside, not to duel with knives, but to settle things with a clean throw in the dirt." Winning brought status. Losing meant laughter, teasing, and often a round of drinks you were expected to buy. The upper classes had their own styles of wrestling as well, though more structured and ceremonial. Knights practiced grappling as part of their military training, learning to throw opponents while wearing armour, or to wrestle effectively when dismounted in battle. Manuals from the German School of Combat even laid out specific holds, locks, and manoeuvres designed for armoured wrestling. A reminder that beneath the elegance of chivalry, medieval warfare could become brutally intimate. Across Europe, regional styles emerged. Cornish wrestling with its distinctive jackets, Breton wrestling with sweeping throws, and Scandinavian forms rooted in Viking tradition. These variations reflected local culture, but the heart of the sport remained the same. 2 people proving their strength and courage through sheer physicality. In a world without gyms, wrestling was the medieval equivalent of weightlifting, martial arts, and social entertainment rolled into one. It revealed character, forged friendships, and sometimes settled grudges, a simple sport carrying the complicated emotions of medieval daily life. If wrestling was raw strength and archery was discipline, medieval football was pure chaos wrapped in tradition. This was the sport that belonged entirely to the common people, loud, muddy, joyful, and sometimes outright dangerous. Forget the rules, uniforms, and referees you might imagine today. Medieval football was closer to a village-wide brawl with a ball somewhere underneath the pile. And yet, despite its brutality, it was adored as one of the most spirited forms of communal play in the Middle Ages. Matches were usually held on feast days like Easter, Shrove Tuesday, or village celebrations. 2 large groups, sometimes entire parishes, met in open fields, narrow alleys, or the long stretches of countryside between towns. The goal could be a church door, a tree, a riverbank, or even the other team's village square. There was no set number of players. 10 people might participate, or several hundred. The field had no boundaries, meaning the game could spill into rivers, barns, or the occasional unfortunate market stall. The only real rule was simple. Get the ball to your side's goal by any means that didn't kill someone. And even that last condition was sometimes taken as more of a suggestion. Tackling, pushing, shoulder checking, and grappling were all allowed. No one blinked at losing a shoe, tearing a tunic, or being shoved face first into a puddle of manure during the match. Injuries were common, broken noses, sprained ankles, fractured ribs. But so was laughter, cheering, and the kind of collective excitement that made the entire village feel alive. The ball itself could be anything from an inflated animal bladder to a leather-wrapped bundle of cloth. Some villages soaked the ball in water to make it heavier and harder to control. Others added ribbons or charms to bring their team luck. Despite the madness, football played an important social role. It bonded neighbours, released tensions, and strengthened community identity. A victory meant pride. A loss meant exaggerated complaints, jokes, and promises to win next year. Not everyone loved the sport, though. Medieval kings repeatedly tried to outlaw football, calling it disruptive, violent, and a distraction from archery practice. But the bans rarely worked. The people loved it too much. Football belonged to them, not the crown. For peasants who toiled endlessly under lords and seasons, medieval football offered something priceless. 90 minutes of unrestrained freedom, muddy camaraderie, and the chance to feel powerful in a world where they seldom held power. While peasants wrestled in fields and chased muddy footballs, nobles practiced sports that looked more like theatrical displays of grace, refinement, and authority. Among these, hawking and hunting were the crown jewels of aristocratic recreation, blending athletic skill with pageantry and deep symbolism. These pursuits were more than simple sport. They were statements of status. To ride through a forest with a falcon perched on your glove, or a pack of hounds racing ahead, was to announce your rank before you even spoke a word. Hawking, also known as falconry, was especially treasured. Training a bird of prey required patience, discipline, and a surprising amount of tenderness. A noble might spend months building trust with a kestrel, peregrine, or goshawk. The bird had to be fed by hand, gently hooded to keep it calm, and rewarded at just the right moments. When everything came together on the hunt, the falcon's flight was a thing of beauty. A sudden burst of wings, a streak in the sky, and then a precise strike on its quarry. The noble holding the bird shared in its glory. This was a sport of subtlety, intelligence, and cultivated elegance. Hunting, on the other hand, was far more physical and theatrical. Mounted hunts involved swift horses, horn calls echoing through the forest, and well-trained hounds bounding over roots and streams. The target, often deer, boar, or fox, was driven into the open by beaters or dogs, giving the noble riders a chance to display courage, speed, and mastery of their mounts. The chase itself was half the thrill. Crashing through underbrush, leaping fallen logs, and manoeuvring through tangled paths demanded real athleticism. Yet, hunting also reinforced medieval hierarchy. Forests were divided into rights, and only the nobility could hunt specific lands or specific animals. A peasant caught poaching could face harsh punishment, fines, imprisonment, or even mutilation in the cruelest regions. This exclusivity made the hunt not just a sport, but a visible reminder of power. The animals, the land, the weapons, and even the clothing, richly embroidered tunics, feathered caps, polished boots, all signalled privilege. Both hawking and hunting also served practical military purposes. A noble skilled in tracking prey or controlling a fast-moving horse had an advantage in battle. Quick reflexes, keen observation, and courage under sudden movement translated directly into martial readiness. For nobles, these sports were a performance of prestige, a graceful ballet of authority played out in forests, meadows, and open skies. If hawking was elegant and hunting was noble, tournaments were pure spectacle. The medieval equivalent of a championship finals match, a parade, and a battlefield rehearsal all rolled into one thunderous event. For knights, tournaments were not merely entertainment. They were opportunities to earn fame, wealth, and the admiration of noble courts. For commoners, they were dazzling displays of power and drama, the closest most people would ever come to witnessing true chivalric combat. A tournament began long before the first lance shattered. Weeks of preparation transformed fields into vibrant arenas decorated with bright banners, family heraldry, and colourful tents. Merchants arrived early, selling roasted meats, sweet pastries, ribbons in house colours and crude souvenirs. Minstrels tuned their instruments as jugglers and acrobats warmed up to entertain the growing crowd. Nobles arrived in procession, dressed in embroidered garments and silk cloaks that shimmered in the sunlight. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. At the centre of the event stood the knights, armoured, disciplined, and eager to prove themselves. Jousting was the most iconic competition. Two mounted knights charged at each other with wooden lances, attempting to strike cleanly against a shield or unhorse their opponent entirely. When done correctly, the impact echoed like a crack of thunder. Splintered wood flew, horses reared, and the crowd erupted. It was controlled violence governed by strict rules, yet every pass demanded courage. One mistake, one slip, could break bones or end a career. Beyond the joust, tournaments featured melee battles, chaotic but organised group fights that tested teamwork and close combat skill. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and knights grappled in swirling dust clouds. Though blunted weapons were used, injuries were common. Yet these melees were essential training, simulating the unpredictability of real warfare while allowing knights to develop strategies and reflexes under pressure. Victory brought immense rewards. A successful knight might win the armour, horse, or ransom of a defeated opponent, gaining wealth that could elevate his status dramatically. Even more precious was the admiration of noble spectators, especially ladies who awarded tokens of favour, such as embroidered scarves or flowers, which knights proudly displayed on their helmets. But tournaments were not only for the elite. Commoners adored them, cheering wildly, placing bets, and retelling every blow for weeks afterward. For one brilliant afternoon, the rigid medieval hierarchy loosened as everyone, peasant and noble alike, shared the thrill of spectacle. Tournaments combined athleticism, honour and pageantry, making them the grandest celebration of medieval sport and martial skill. Not every medieval contest was fought with muscle, mud or weapons. Some battles took place quietly across wooden tables, where minds clashed instead of bodies. Board games, from early chess to Hnefatafel, backgammon and dice, were a deeply rooted part of medieval recreation. These games served as mental training, social bonding, and sometimes subtle political manoeuvring, depending on who was playing. Chess, introduced to Europe through the Islamic world, quickly became the favourite of the nobility. Its ranks of pawns, knights, bishops, and queens mirrored the very structure of feudal society, making the game feel symbolic as well as strategic. To play chess well meant demonstrating intelligence, patience, and foresight, virtues admired in court life. A nobleman who mastered the board might impress lords and ladies with his wit just as much as through riding or fencing. In some courts, chess became a tool for diplomacy. Rivals tested one another's minds, and alliances strengthened over hours of quiet, thoughtful play. Monasteries also embraced board games, especially forms of Hnefatafel and early chess. Contrary to the stereotype of joyless discipline, monks enjoyed games that sharpened strategic thinking and provided mild relief from the rigours of cloistered life. Some abbots encouraged such games, believing they trained monks to resist temptation, plan spiritual study, and meditate with more focus. A monk contemplating a clever move wasn't so different from one contemplating a theological question. Both required clarity and discipline. Dice games, on the other hand, belonged mostly to taverns, inns, and back-alley gatherings. Peasants, merchants, and soldiers played them for small wages, testing their luck with bone-carved cubes that clattered loudly across rough wooden tables. These games were fast, noisy, and addictive. They could turn friends into rivals in minutes, and they were famous for sparking arguments, laughter, and the occasional drunken brawl. Medieval authorities disliked dice gambling, viewing it as a distraction from work and moral duty, but no amount of scolding or fines ever stopped people from playing. Backgammon, known as tables, was another common pastime. It offered a balance of skill and chance, appealing to those who wanted competition without the unpredictability of dice alone. Soldiers played it between campaigns, Merchants played it while travelling, and nobles played it during quiet evenings in their halls. Board games were the medieval world's way of testing the mind, just as physical sports tested the body. Whether in a monastery cloister or a smoky tavern, the clack of pieces and the tension of strategy brought people together across social divides. While adults fenced, hunted, and wrestled, medieval children shaped their world through play that mixed imagination, imitation, and surprisingly practical skill building. Childhood in the Middle Ages was short. Many young people began working at 7 or 8, yet play still carved out a vital space in their daily lives. It taught coordination, courage, creativity, and social bonds long before they entered the demanding world of adult labour. Children played with what they had. Wealthier families provided carved wooden toys, miniature shields, cloth dolls, wooden horses, and small carts. Some noble children even practiced with toy swords made of padded leather, preparing for the roles they were expected to fill. A young boy destined for knighthood might spend hours pretending to defend a castle made of stacked firewood. A young girl from a noble household might reenact feasts or festivals with her dolls, learning etiquette and the gestures of courtly behaviour. Play for them was rehearsal for adulthood. Village children, meanwhile, relied on nature and resourcefulness. They crafted toys from sticks, mud, straw and stones. A round bundle of rags became a ball. A scrap of cloth tied around a reed became a doll. A curved branch turned into a bow. Their games were energetic and spontaneous, running races along narrow paths, climbing trees, chasing one another through fields, and skipping stones across ponds. One popular game involved Blind Man's Buff, where a blindfolded child tried to catch others by sound alone, filling the air with laughter and playful shrieks. Children also played mock sports inspired by adults. Young boys practiced wrestling in soft dirt or tried to shoot blunt arrows at straw targets. Girls joined in too, especially in games of tag, hoop rolling, singing circles, and stone skipping. Contrary to many modern assumptions, medieval childhood wasn't completely divided by gender. In many rural communities, children played together freely before adult responsibilities separated them. Board games and storytelling were also major parts of childhood recreation. Simple dice games taught math and probability, while riddles and songs preserved local folklore. Children listened eagerly to travelling minstrels, then recreated the tales in their own small performances under trees or in barns. Even chores blended into play. Fetching water turned into a race. Minding geese became a game of pretending the flock was an army. Sweeping a yard became an excuse to draw patterns in the dust. Children's play, in all its forms, was a vital part of medieval life. A world where imagination thrived despite hardship, giving young people the skills, courage, and community they needed to enter adulthood. In the Middle Ages, games and sports were not isolated events. They blossomed most vibrantly during festivals and feast days, when entire communities briefly escaped the grind of daily life. These celebrations transformed villages, towns, and even castle courtyards into lively arenas where social classes mingled, rivalries flared, and the rhythms of work gave way to laughter, noise, and athletic display. Sport during festivals carried deeper meaning than entertainment alone. It reinforced identity, healed tensions, and reminded people they belonged to something greater than themselves. Festivals were tied to the agricultural and religious calendar. After the harvest, when barns were full and work slowed, villagers celebrated with days of feasting, music, and friendly competition. Football matches surged through fields. Wrestling pits were lined with cheering spectators, and archery contests offered proud farmers the chance to prove their skill before neighbours and visiting lords. Victors earned ribbons, bread, ale, or simply the honour of having their name associated with strength or precision for the rest of the year. For nobles, festivals offered opportunities to display wealth and generosity. Lords sponsored athletic contests, providing prizes such as cloaks, silver cups, or livestock. Their sponsorship wasn't purely charitable, it reinforced loyalty. A peasant who won a sheep or purse of coins from his lord felt proud, respected, and more connected to the feudal order. Meanwhile, Nobles demonstrated their own prowess through fencing bouts, riding displays, and ceremonial hunts, reminding everyone of the martial ideals that justified their status. Religious festivals blended spiritual devotion with communal joy. On feast days dedicated to saints, villages erupted into games that symbolized renewal and blessing. Tug-of-war contests represented the struggle between good and evil. Dances and singing circles expressed unity. Children's games filled the air with laughter. Even monks, usually strict in their routines, sometimes organized modest contests or board games to celebrate major holy days. Markets and trade fairs brought another layer of festivity. Merchants from distant regions arrived with foreign games, exotic trinkets, and travelling performers. Jugglers, tumblers, musicians, and mock fighters entertained crowds, blurring the line between sport and spectacle. These gatherings introduced new ideas and styles of play, expanding the medieval imagination beyond local traditions. At the heart of every festival was a simple truth. Sports were social glue. Whether through a friendly wrestling match, a competitive archery contest, or a muddy football game, medieval people reconnected with each other. For moments in time, exhaustion, hierarchy, and hardship vanished, replaced by celebration, community, and the shared joy of play. Babylon was a city of heat, dust, and restless ambition, the perfect stage for a king who had spent his entire life chasing the horizon. In early June of 323 BCE, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, normally alive with soldiers, scribes, and envoys, fell into a strange, heavy silence. Word had spread like wildfire. Alexander, the undefeated general who had conquered lands from Greece to the edges of India, was gravely ill. Men who had marched with him through deserts and monsoons now stood helpless outside his door, waiting for news that never seemed to improve. Just weeks earlier, Alexander had been planning new campaigns. His restless mind imagined an Arabian conquest, massive shipyards, and new trade routes that would bind his vast empire together. Babylon was to be the empire's glittering capital, a place where Greek and Persian culture blended into something bold and new. Alexander toured the marshes, inspected harbours, and made sacrifices to the gods. He drank with his companions, hosted feasts, and dreamed aloud about lands that were still unclaimed. Nothing in those days hinted that his life would end before summer. Then the fever struck. It began quietly, almost innocently. At a banquet honouring his admiral Nearchus, Alexander complained of a sharp pain after drinking wine. Some said he shivered. Others claimed he cried out and clutched his side. He brushed it off at first, blaming exhaustion from constant planning. But by the next morning, he could barely stand. His generals carried him back to his chambers, believing the great king would recover as he always had. Swiftly, stubbornly, almost supernaturally. But the fever refused to break. Over the next days, Alexander drifted in and out of clarity. The man who had crossed the Hindu Kush, who had faced war elephants and storms at sea, now struggled simply to speak. His voice, once powerful enough to rally thousands, had thinned to a whisper. His eyes burned with fever. His body, normally unshakable, felt heavy and unresponsive. Outside his room, soldiers gathered by the thousands, begging for any sign of improvement. They prayed to Greek gods, Babylonian gods, and any power they believed might spare the king who had led them across the world. Inside the dim palace chambers, the heat of Babylon pressed down. Incense burned, doctors whispered, and on a low couch, surrounded by the anxious silence of his empire, Alexander the Great faced the first enemy he could not defeat. Alexander had survived wounds that would have killed ordinary men, an arrow through the lung in India, a fractured skull from a siege engine in the Balkans, and countless cuts, bruises, and infections from years of warfare. His soldiers believed he possessed a kind of divine resilience, a spark of Heracles or Achilles burning inside him. But in Babylon, all those old wounds, the strain of endless marching, and the exhaustion of command, finally demanded their price. His body, once carved by discipline and battle, began to collapse with startling speed. The fever tightened its grip. At first, he could sit upright, giving short commands to generals and scribes, but each day drained him further. By the third day, he could no longer walk without support. His limbs felt heavy, as if filled with wet sand. Sweat poured from him in waves, soaking the fine linens beneath him. Even turning his head caused pain. His physicians tried everything the ancient world could offer: warm baths, cool compresses, wine mixed with herbs, prayers to Asclepius. Nothing helped. Outside, anxiety spread like smoke. Alexander's army was composed of hardened veterans who had followed him from Macedon to the ends of the earth. They had seen him wounded, bleeding, raging, laughing, but never helpless. Now they waited in tight knots around the palace gates, whispering about omens. Some claimed that the gods were punishing him for burning Persepolis. Others insisted he had been poisoned by jealous generals. A few dared to hope he would rise again, restored by the divine spirits he so often invoked. Inside his chamber, the truth was far simpler and far crueler. Alexander's strength was disappearing. His appetite vanished. His breath grew shallow. His fever rose high enough to make him delirious, muttering half-formed plans for future campaigns. He tried to stand once, insisting he needed to inspect his fleet preparations, but his legs buckled, and only the quick reflexes of his guards kept him from falling. By the seventh day, he could no longer speak clearly. He gestured instead, pointing weakly toward maps on the wall, trying to communicate without words. His friends, men like Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Hephaestion's old companions, stood powerless as the unstoppable king who had never retreated in battle now retreated into silence. The palace was filled with the constant shuffle of sandals, the scent of incense, and the unbearable weight of waiting. News spread rapidly. Alexander's condition was no longer simply worrying, it was fatal. The conqueror of Asia, the man who had outrun death for a decade, was finally being overtaken. As Alexander's fever intensified, the mood inside the palace shifted from concern to raw panic. His companions, the men who had fought beside him for more than a decade, were not merely officers. They were childhood friends, brothers in arms, and political rivals all at once. With Alexander weakening, their unity began to splinter. Every whispered conversation carried the weight of an empire. Every exchanged glance hinted at suspicion, ambition, or fear. Perdiccas, the royal bodyguard and one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, positioned himself as guardian of the king's chambers. He controlled access to Alexander, deciding which generals could enter and when. Some saw this as loyalty. Others viewed it as the first step of a power grab. Ptolemy, the calculating and charismatic general who had long kept a strategic distance, watched Perdiccas closely, already assessing the shifting balance of power. The old veterans, Craterus, Seleucus, and Antipater's supporters, felt the empire slipping into chaos before their king had even died. Rumours multiplied like flies in the Babylonian heat. One faction whispered that Alexander had been poisoned by Antipater's sons, Cassander or Iolus. Another group blamed Meleager, who had recently clashed with Perdiccas over military promotions. Still others murmured of curses, prophecies, and divine jealousy, that the gods had finally grown tired of a mortal claiming to be their equal. With no clear information, suspicion filled the gaps. Inside the palace halls, the companions gathered at Alexander's bedside in turns. They watched their king struggle to breathe, his skin flushed with fever. Some held his hand, some knelt in prayer, and some silently calculated their next moves. For years they had followed one man's unbreakable will. Now that will flickered like a torch in the wind, and no one knew what would happen when it finally went out. The Macedonian soldiers camped outside grew restless. They demanded to see their king. They wanted assurances he would recover. They wanted someone, anyone, to tell them what would happen next. Without Alexander, they were leaderless men thousands of miles from home, surrounded by conquered people who might rise at any moment. The tension was thick enough to spark violence. The companions, normally so decisive in battle, now felt paralyzed. Without Alexander's voice guiding them, they were reduced to anxious shadows. Empires could be conquered by armies, but they could crumble just as easily from fear. In those suffocating days, as the palace trembled with uncertainty, everyone understood the truth they dared not speak. The fate of the world depended on one dying man. As Alexander's condition deteriorated, Babylon transformed from a royal capital into a pressure cooker ready to explode. Outside the palace gates, thousands of Macedonian soldiers, veterans of a decade of conquest, gathered in swelling crowds. These were the men who had followed Alexander through deserts, across frozen mountain passes, and into the very heart of empires. They had stood shield to shield with him in battle. They had buried friends beside him. And now, as rumours of his impending death spread, they demanded the right to see him with their own eyes. But Perdiccas and the other commanders hesitated. Allowing thousands of heavily armed, terrified, grieving warriors to flood the palace could spiral into violence instantly. The mood among the ranks was already volatile. Soldiers feared being abandoned in a foreign land if their king died. They feared mutiny from the Greek contingents. They feared revenge uprisings from the cities Alexander had conquered. Most of all, they feared the unknown. In Alexander's absence, who would command them? Who would pay them? Who would lead them home? It was a dangerous mix, loyalty turning into desperation. When the generals tried to keep the troops away from the palace, a roar went up among the men. They accused their commanders of hiding the truth, of planning their own takeover of the empire. Some soldiers threw stones at messengers, others beat their shields and shouted Alexander's name until their throats burned. The tension snapped when a group of infantrymen forced their way toward the palace entrance, only to be blocked by elite royal guards. For a moment, swords nearly drew. Only fear of dishonouring Alexander stopped the two sides from clashing. Finally, to prevent open revolt, the commanders relented. One of the most haunting scenes in ancient history unfolded. The dying king, barely able to move, asked to be carried out on a stretcher so his soldiers could see him. He could not speak, but he lifted his hand slowly, acknowledging them. That single gesture dissolved the fury of thousands. Hardened veterans broke into tears. Some begged him to recover, others whispered prayers as he passed. They understood what his silent presence meant. Their king was dying, but he had not abandoned them. Even in agony, he honoured them with his final strength. That moment calmed the troops, but it did not solve the deeper crisis. The soldiers returned to their camps with grief instead of rage, but they also returned with the terrifying knowledge that Alexander, the glue holding their vast empire together, would not survive the week. And without him, the world they had built through blood and fire was about to fracture. By the 10th day of fever, Alexander was barely conscious. The palace was filled with the scent of incense, whispered prayers, and the steady footsteps of anxious attendants. His generals crowded the chamber, faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. They needed one thing above all: a successor. The empire stretched from Greece to India. Without a clear heir, chaos was not just possible, it was inevitable. But Alexander had no legitimate adult son. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, and no one knew whether the child would be a boy. His half-brother Aridaeus was alive, but he struggled with cognitive impairment and was unfit to rule alone. The commanders pressed in, demanding guidance. Who should inherit the greatest empire the world had ever seen? Alexander, drifting in and out of consciousness, seemed to understand. His voice had been almost gone for days, but when asked whom he wished to succeed him, the dying king managed one final whisper that sent a shiver through the room. "To the strongest." The words were so faint that some claimed they didn't hear them. Others insisted he said something else entirely, perhaps to Craterus, the name of a powerful general who was not present. But the version that endured, the version carried by the men who stood closest to him, was clear. Alexander left his empire to strength, not lineage. It was a brilliant but devastating answer. With that single phrase, he He ensured that his generals, seasoned, ambitious, and deeply competitive, would fight for control of the empire he had built. Some later blamed him for this. Others argued he knew exactly what he was doing. His companions were warriors shaped by years of conquest. He trusted their strength more than any bloodline, but his generals wanted more. They gathered around him again, asking how his funeral should be arranged. Even in his final moments, Alexander thought like a king. He said he wished to be buried in the sanctuary of Ammon at Siwa, the place where Egyptian priests had declared him the son of Zeus. It was a symbolic choice, one that linked his death to divine identity. Shortly after, Alexander lost the ability to speak entirely. His eyes dimmed. His breathing slowed to a faint rasp. The companions held their breaths. Servants wiped sweat from his brow. Outside, thousands of soldiers waited, unable to accept what was unfolding within. Then, at 32 years old, Alexander the Great slipped silently into death, leaving behind a world that would never agree on his final words, nor recover from the consequences of them. The moment Alexander died, an eerie stillness settled over Babylon. No trumpet sounded, no proclamation went out. Only the quiet realization that the heart of a vast empire had stopped beating. His companions stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had led them across continents. But the silence didn't last. Outside the palace, tens of thousands of soldiers demanded answers. Inside, the most powerful men in the world turned toward each other with a single unspoken question. What now? The problem was colossal. Alexander had ruled not just a kingdom, but a patchwork of newly conquered territories held together entirely by his charisma and authority. There was no established system, no bureaucratic machine strong enough to run things on its own. His generals were brilliant in war, but they had never needed to govern an empire of this scale. They had always relied on Alexander's decisions, Alexander's vision, Alexander's relentless drive. Now they faced the impossible task of replacing him. Two factions immediately emerged. Perdiccas and his supporters argued that power should rest with Roxana's unborn child, if it was a boy, with themselves acting as guardians until he came of age. This would give Perdiccas enormous influence. Opposing them were the infantry, led unofficially by Meleager, who wanted Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, to be crowned king. Aridaeus was mentally unfit to rule, but that was precisely the point. He could be controlled. The debate spiraled into shouting, threats, and accusations. Even before Alexander's body cooled, the men who had conquered the world together were already dividing it in their minds. Babylon's corridors echoed with arguments. Some generals stormed out of meetings in fury, others plotted quietly. A few spoke of splitting the empire into separate kingdoms, but the idea felt treasonous. Alexander had bled for every inch of it. Meanwhile, the soldiers grew restless once more. They would not tolerate elites making decisions behind closed doors. They wanted clarity, stability, and pay. Most of all, they wanted reassurance that the empire they had built through blood would not collapse into civil war. For days, negotiations teetered on the edge of violence. No single solution satisfied everyone. But one thing was clear. Without Alexander's voice guiding them, unity was slipping through their fingers. The empire that had once stretched like a golden thread from Greece to India was beginning to fray. Alexander's death had created a vacuum, and nature, politics, and ambition all rushed to fill it. The fragile alliance among Alexander's companions shattered almost immediately. What had once been a unified force of brilliant commanders now splintered into rival factions, each convinced they were the rightful inheritors of the empire. The Greeks later called them the Diadochi, the successors, and their struggle would plunge the ancient world into nearly 4 decades of war. The first spark came in Babylon itself. Perdiccas, appointed regent over both Aridaeus and Roxana's unborn child, believed he held supreme authority. Many officers accepted this, but others bristled under his rising power. Meleager, champion of the infantry, refused to recognize Perdiccas's control. Tensions exploded when Meleager's troops stormed the palace and threatened the Macedonian council, demanding Aridaeus be crowned immediately. A massacre nearly erupted in the corridors where Alexander had lain dying. Perdiccas responded ruthlessly. After carefully regaining control, he arrested and executed Meleager, an unmistakable message to anyone who challenged him. But even this decisive act couldn't stop the growing fractures. Trust was gone, and suspicion now ruled every conversation. The generals who had once ridden together toward the unknown were now circling each other like wolves. In the partition of Babylon, the empire was carved into massive territories. Ptolemy received Egypt, a rich and strategically isolated region he immediately began strengthening. Seleucus gained command of the companion cavalry. Antigonus took Phrygia and the lands of Asia Minor. Lysimachus gained Thrace. Each man accepted his new domain with a polite smile, but behind those smiles lay ambition burning like a fever. Alexander had conquered the world in the name of unity. His successors prepared to tear it apart. Perdiccas, determined to maintain central authority, soon clashed with these rising powers. Ptolemy was the first to defy him openly by hijacking Alexander's funeral procession and taking the king's body to Egypt, a symbolic act meant to legitimize his rule. Perdiccas was enraged, a fury that would ultimately destroy him. But the wars of the Diadochi were not simply political, they were personal. These men had shared tents, battlefields, and dangers for more than a decade. They knew each other's strengths and flaws intimately. Their rivalries grew from old grudges, jealousies, and conflicting visions of Alexander's legacy. Every battle they waged was fueled not just by ambition, but by the desire to be the one who inherited the legend, to be seen as the true continuation of Alexander's greatness. The age of conquest was over. The age of successors had begun. Even in death, Alexander the Great refused to rest quietly. His body became the most contested object in the ancient world, a prize that carried political legitimacy, divine symbolism, and the right to claim his mantle. Whoever possessed Alexander's corpse, many believed, could claim to be his true successor. And so, even his funeral became a battlefield. Alexander had requested to be buried at the sanctuary of Ammon in Siwa, a sacred site in the Egyptian desert where priests had once hailed him as the son of Zeus. But his generals had other plans. Perdiccas, determined to maintain control over the entire empire, ordered the construction of an extravagant funerary carriage to transport Alexander back to Macedon. This massive golden vehicle, shaped like a temple and pulled by 64 mules, was meant to be a rolling monument to the king's greatness, and a symbol of Perdiccas's intent to guard his legacy. But Ptolemy had watched these developments with calculating eyes. As governor of Egypt, he understood the power of possessing Alexander's body. Egypt, with its sacred traditions of kingship, could transform him from mere general into heir of a pharaoh-like ruler. When the funeral procession left Babylon, Ptolemy acted swiftly. His forces intercepted the carriage near Syria and redirected the body to Egypt. It was a masterstroke, bloodless, symbolic, and devastating to Perdiccas. When news reached Babylon, Perdiccas erupted in fury. He accused Ptolemy of treason, blasphemy, and treachery, but the deed was done. Alexander's body now rested in Memphis and later Alexandria, where Ptolemy constructed a magnificent tomb that drew pilgrims, scholars, and rulers from across the Mediterranean. The theft of the corpse changed everything. Perdiccas' authority crumbled. His allies questioned his strength. His enemies celebrated Ptolemy's brilliance. The symbolism was clear. Alexander may have left his empire to the strongest, and Ptolemy had just proven he intended to be exactly that. Soon Perdiccas launched an ill-fated invasion of Egypt, where he met defeat, mutiny, and death, his bid for supremacy crushed by the man who held Alexander's body. For the rest of antiquity, Alexander's tomb remained one of the most revered sites in the world. Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, and Augustus all visited it. Rulers prayed there, seeking a fragment of Alexander's charisma. But over time, the tomb's location disappeared from history, swallowed by shifting sands and urban expansion. Even today, the resting place of the world's greatest conqueror remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, a king without a tomb. Alexander the Great died young, but his legend refused to fade. In the years after his death, his empire shattered into competing kingdoms, his generals betrayed and killed one another, and his family line was wiped out in the ruthless struggles of the Diadochi. Yet none of this diminished the power of his name. If anything, the chaos that followed only amplified the magnitude of what he had achieved. No one else could hold the world together as he had. No one else could command such loyalty, or inspire such fear. As war engulfed the empire he had built, stories about Alexander multiplied. Soldiers who had marched behind him recalled moments of daring and madness. Scholars recorded his campaigns, turning battles into epics. Poets elevated him to the level of myth, comparing him to Achilles, Dionysus, and even gods. Across the Mediterranean, parents told their children tales of the king who rode like a storm across the world, who wept because there were no more lands left to conquer. Even his flaws became part of the legend. His temper, his drinking, his relentless ambition, all were woven into a portrait of a man whose humanity was as colossal as his achievements. Alexander wasn't worshipped as a flawless hero. He was remembered as a force of nature, driven by something beyond ordinary desire, the need to test the limits of what a mortal could accomplish. That intensity made him both admired and feared. Meanwhile, the kingdoms of his successors evolved into powerful states: Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, Macedon, and others. They built cities, libraries, temples, and trade networks that shaped the ancient world for centuries. Yet each of them, whether openly or subtly, claimed to be the true bearer of Alexander's legacy. His generals fought for his empire, but they also fought for his memory. As if ruling in his shadow gave them legitimacy, over time, Alexander became a universal symbol. Romans studied his tactics. Medieval Europeans called him the perfect king. Islamic scholars admired his curiosity and endurance. Asian traditions preserved versions of his story that made him a wandering philosopher hero. Everywhere his name travelled, it adapted, transforming into something new while retaining its core, the idea of boundless ambition, and that may be his greatest legacy. Alexander's empire did not survive him, but his example did. The belief that one person, through daring and vision, could shape the world. He died in Babylon at 32, but his legend never did. It lives in every tale of conquest, every map of ancient glory, and every dream of achieving the impossible. In the rugged valleys and forested mountains of ancient Illyria, spirituality was not confined to walled temples or marble sanctuaries. It lived in the open air, in the rustling of ancient oaks, in the echo of waterfalls, and in the wind that swept across limestone cliffs. This was a land where nature itself was considered divine, where the border between the human world and the realm of gods and ancestors felt thin enough to touch. And standing at the very centre of that spiritual landscape were the Illyrian priestesses. These women were far more than ritual attendants. They were intermediaries between clans and the unseen forces that shaped their lives. Known for their sharp intuition, deep knowledge of herbs, and uncanny ability to read signs in nature, they served as the spiritual backbone of Illyrian tribes. Their presence was sought in times of war, famine, marriage, childbirth, and negotiation. When leaders wavered or warriors doubted, it was the priestesses who consulted omens and whispered guidance. Sacred groves were their sanctuaries, clusters of ancient trees believed to harbour protective spirits. A grove might consist of towering oaks whose roots curled like serpents through the soil, or mountain pines that groaned in the wind like voices of the ancestors. These spaces were deliberately left untouched by axes. No hunting was allowed within them, no wood taken for fire. Even chieftains approached the groves with humility, removing weapons and speaking in lowered tones. Within these circles of living nature, the priestesses performed rituals that blended song, dance, and offerings of grain, milk, wine, or honey. From a young age, selected girls showed signs of connection. Maybe they dreamed vividly. Maybe animals responded strangely to them. Maybe they wandered into the forest and returned speaking of lights or voices. When elders noticed these traits, the girl would be brought to a senior priestess for evaluation. If accepted, she entered years of training, learning chants, divination techniques, herbal medicine, and the symbolic language of fire, wind, and water. The Illyrians believed women possessed a unique sensitivity to the spirit world. Their intuition, ability to give life, and deep emotional intelligence made them the ideal vessels for divine messages. When a priestess entered a trance, people believed the gods spoke through her. When she raised her hands toward the sky, clans felt protected. When she walked through the sacred grove, even the wind seemed to hush. These women were revered, feared, and depended upon. They were the quiet power behind Illyrian decision-making, the keepers of spiritual balance in a land where nature and divinity were inseparable. Divination lay at the heart of Illyrian priestess traditions. To understand the will of the gods, the priestesses turned not to scrolls or carved inscriptions, but to the living elements of the natural world. The Illyrians believed the universe communicated constantly, in the rustle of leaves, the movement of smoke, the direction of wind, the crackling of fire. The task of the priestess was to listen. Wind was one of the most sacred messengers. In hilltop sanctuaries where the air flowed freely across stone altars, priestesses would stand with their arms open, eyes half closed, waiting for gusts to shift. A sudden change in direction could be interpreted as approval or warning. A warm breeze was seen as ancestral comfort. A cold, sharp wind signaled tension or conflict ahead. Entire clans postponed raids, migrations, or diplomatic meetings, depending on how the wind spoke through the priestess. To outsiders, this might have seemed mysterious, but to Illyrians it was as normal as watching clouds before a storm. Fire was equally essential. Torchlight was used not only in rituals, but in communication with the gods. Priestesses lit sacred fires inside groves, caves, or mountaintop shrines. They observed the flames intently, their height, their colour, the way sparks leapt upward. If the fire hissed or bent sharply in one direction, it was believed a spirit was trying to speak. When the flames burned steadily and cleanly, it meant the offering had been accepted. When they sputtered or dimmed unexpectedly, something in the village needed cleansing or caution. During major ceremonies, the priestess would scatter herbs, juniper, sage, thyme, or wild mountain flowers, into the fire. Each plant produced a different smell and smoke pattern, allowing her to interpret layers of meaning. Smoke drifting toward the east was linked to new beginnings. Smoke swirling downward suggested hidden danger. Villagers watched in breathless silence as the priestess traced shapes in the smoke, murmuring invocations to ancestor spirits. But perhaps the most dramatic ritual involved entering a trance beside a sacred flame. Sitting cross-legged, eyes fixed on the glowing embers, the priestess breathed slowly until her mind slipped into a liminal state. Witnesses reported that her voice would deepen or soften, her gestures becoming fluid and dreamlike. In these moments, people believed she crossed into the world beyond, retrieving messages from deities like Prender, Vidasus, or the shrouded spirits of the mountains. Illyrian chieftains trusted these visions completely. A priestess's reading could start a war, end a feud, or save a village from famine. Her interpretations carried spiritual authority so respected that few dared to question them. In a land governed by both blade and spirit, she was the voice that guided entire tribes. To the Illyrians, the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, shifting like mist over mountain lakes. The ancestors were not distant memories. They were present forces, guardians who walked alongside their descendants. Every clan believed their strength, luck, and prosperity came from honouring those who had lived before. And the ones responsible for maintaining that sacred relationship were the priestesses, entrusted as keepers of ancestral memory. Their role began with ritual knowledge. Each clan's history was carried not in written records, but in songs, chants, and oral genealogies passed from one priestess to the next. They memorized lineage sequences, stretching back centuries, reciting them during seasonal festivals or before major decisions. By speaking the names of the ancestors aloud, the priestess was believed to awaken them, ensuring their presence in the affairs of the living. This practice strengthened tribal unity. It reminded warriors, farmers, and leaders that they were part of something far older and larger than themselves. Priestesses also oversaw burial rites. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, the Illyrians emphasized earth and stone more than monumental architecture. Bodies were placed in shallow graves or stone cists, surrounded by personal items, weapons, jewellery, drinking vessels, or charms carved from bone. The priestess performed purification rituals involving water and smoke, guiding the soul safely to the realm of the ancestors. Without her blessing, the spirit was believed to wander restlessly, causing illness or misfortune. Ancestral communication was another essential task. Families sought the priestess when drought struck, when livestock fell ill, or when disputes threatened to divide the clan. She entered trance states, often in secluded caves known for their echoes, places where the Illyrians believed voices of the dead whispered naturally. There she asked for clarity. Which ancestor was displeased? What needed to be corrected? Sometimes the answer involved simple offerings of bread or milk. Other times the solution was more complex, ending a feud, repairing a dishonoured oath, or restoring land taken unjustly. Seasonal festivals amplified her role. During the winter solstice, when the line between worlds was believed to thin, the priestess led night-long ceremonies with torches and rhythmic chants. The entire tribe participated, invoking ancestral protection for the coming year. She guided them in dances that symbolized renewal, survival, and communal strength. Every movement, every chant reinforced the idea that the ancestors were watching, and that their favor determined the tribe's future. In Illyrian belief, a community without its ancestors was a body without a soul, and the priestess was the one who ensured that connection never broke. She guarded the invisible bridge between past and present, giving shape and meaning to the tribe's identity through generations. While Illyrian priestesses were famed for divination and ancestral rituals, another dimension of their authority lay in their deep knowledge of herbs, remedies, and traditional healing. In a land of wild mountains, unpredictable weather, and constant tribal conflict, the priestess served not only as a spiritual guide, but also as the closest thing many communities had to a physician. Her healing arts blended practical knowledge with sacred symbolism, creating a system where medicine and magic intertwined seamlessly. Her training began early. Apprentices learned to identify plants in every season, from the purple blossoms of mountain gentian to the bitter roots of hellebore. They studied how leaves wilted under different temperatures, how bark changed texture with age, and how certain flowers opened only at dawn or dusk. Knowledge was passed orally through metaphors and stories. A plant that whispers at night might calm fevers. One that bites the tongue could purge poisons. These poetic descriptions helped novices memorize complex properties long before written medical texts appeared in the region. Priestesses were experts at preparing salves, tinctures, poultices, and teas. They treated everything from broken bones and infected wounds to childbirth complications and snake bites. Hunters relied on them for antidotes to venom. Warriors trusted their balms to prevent infection after battle. Even chieftains sought their counsel for lingering sicknesses. Healing sessions often took place near running water or inside sacred groves, where the environment itself reinforced the spiritual dimension of recovery. Yet healing was never purely physical. For the Illyrians, illness had emotional and spiritual causes as well. A man suffering nightmares might be told he had angered an ancestor. A woman with chronic pain might be carrying unspoken resentment or grief. The priestess listened carefully, offering not just herbs but symbolic rituals, burning juniper to cleanse a home, tying protective knots in wool threads, or burying a small offering at the foot of an old oak. These acts restored balance, a key principle in Illyrian belief. Some rites were dramatic. During serious illnesses, the priestess performed night healings, lighting a fire and chanting until the flames rose steady and strong. She placed specific herbs into the fire, interpreting the crackling sounds as signs of progress. Family members watched anxiously as she circled the sick person with smoke, whispering prayers to mountain spirits for strength. When recovery followed, gratitude often transformed into lifelong loyalty. Because of this healing wisdom, priestesses enjoyed immense respect. They carried the trust of mothers, warriors, elders, and children alike. Their remedies travelled across valleys, influencing neighbouring tribes. In an age where survival depended on harmony with nature, the priestess stood at the intersection of knowledge and belief, a healer whose touch meant both scientific intuition and spiritual reassurance. In Illyrian society, politics and spirituality were never separate. Chieftains could command warriors, negotiate alliances, and enforce tribal laws, but the priestesses commanded something deeper: legitimacy. Their insight shaped decisions that determined the fate of clans. When tensions rose, when omens darkened, or when blades flashed between rival tribes, leaders turned to the priestess for clarity. She was the voice that translated the will of gods and ancestors into human action. Before any war, her role was essential. Warriors did not march until the priestess performed a pre-battle omen reading. This ritual took place in sacred groves or at mountain shrines where the wind travelled freely. She listened to the rustling leaves, watched the paths of birds, or cast marked bones onto animal skins. If the signs were favourable, she blessed the weapons, dipping blades in consecrated water or brushing them with branches of juniper for protection. But if the omens warned of disaster, even the fiercest war leader hesitated. To march against the priestess's council was to risk divine wrath. Her influence extended beyond battlefields. During negotiations between rival clans, she was often the mediator, or at least the unseen force behind an agreement. In councils held around fire pits, the priestess stood or sat beside the chieftain, offering spiritual interpretation of political choices. She weighed not just practical benefits, but ancestral expectations. Which choice honoured past oaths? Which path risked offending spirits that guarded the land? There were moments when her words changed history. A well-documented Illyrian tradition tells of priestesses who halted raids by declaring certain days or seasons taboo for violence, holy periods when the earth needed rest and bloodshed was forbidden. Even hardened warriors obeyed. The taboo was too sacred to violate. In these pauses, clans forged temporary alliances, held feasts, or resolved grievances. But priestesses also acted as protectors of peace within the tribe. If tensions simmered between families, she called both sides to a cleansing ritual. Fires were lit, bitter herbs were burned to clear resentment, and symbolic knots were tied and untied to represent the loosening of conflict. Such acts prevented feuds from erupting into long-lasting vendettas. During times of famine, plague, or natural disaster, the priestess became the community's anchor. She interpreted what offerings were needed to restore balance, whether it required food offerings, communal fasting, or rites honouring neglected ancestors. Her guidance gave people hope when the world felt unstable. Her influence was so profound that Illyrian warriors often said, "A tribe marches under its chieftain, but survives under its priestess." In Illyrian spiritual tradition, priestesses were not merely chosen, they were transformed. Becoming a priestess required undergoing a series of powerful initiation rituals that reshaped identity, sharpened intuition, and connected the initiate to the world of spirits. These ceremonies were designed to test courage, discipline, and sensitivity to the unseen. Through them, a girl stepped out of ordinary life and entered the sacred path, reborn as a vessel of divine knowledge. Initiation often began at night, under the glow of the moon. The moon was considered a symbol of feminine power and spiritual clarity. Senior priestesses led the initiate into a clearing within a sacred grove. where only the crackling of a small fire broke the silence. The initiate wore simple garments woven from undyed wool, representing purity, humility, and readiness. Around her neck hung a charm carved from bone or stone, a protective amulet that bound her to the ancestor spirits. The first phase was the trial of silence. For a full day and night, the initiate remained in complete quiet, listening to the forest. The Illyrians believed that true spiritual attunement began when a person learned to hear more than human voices. The fluttering of birds, the shifting wind, distant animal calls, even the subtle movement of leaves. This silence trained the initiate to recognize patterns and messages that others dismissed as noise. The second phase involved learning sacred chants and rhythmic breathing techniques. Priestesses believed that the voice could open pathways to the divine if used correctly. Through controlled breathing, the initiate prepared her mind for trance states. Chants were passed from elder to novice like torches, ancient, unbroken, and carried with reverence. The final and most fearsome phase was the descent into trance. Under close supervision, the initiate sat before a sacred flame, inhaling the aromatic smoke of juniper, thyme, and mugwort. These herbs were known to induce clarity and heighten perception. As the heat washed over her and the chants rose, the initiate entered a trance meant to reveal her spiritual potential. Some described visions of ancestors or luminous figures. Others felt themselves drifting through forests or mountains. These visions were interpreted by senior priestesses, who decided whether the initiate possessed the depth required for priestly duties. If she succeeded, she received ceremonial markings, often a spiral or wave-like symbol painted on her arms or forehead using ash and herbal paste. These marks declared her rebirth, her connection to the sacred, and her readiness to serve. Initiation was not just a rite of passage, it was a metamorphosis, forging women capable of guiding clans through hardship, interpreting the unseen, and carrying the spiritual legacy of the Illyrians into every generation. Across the Illyrian homeland, certain landscapes were believed to pulse with spiritual power, places where the earth felt alive, where the veil between the mortal world and the divine was thin enough for messages to slip through. These were the sacred groves, caves, springs, and mountaintops guarded by priestesses, protected by strict laws, and feared by those who understood the consequences of trespassing. These spaces were the heart of Illyrian ritual and identity. The most revered among them were the sacred groves. These were not gardens or cultivated spaces, but wild clusters of ancient trees, usually oaks, beeches, or pines. Their vast roots twisted through the earth like veins of power. No woodcutter dared enter them. No hunter pursued game across their boundaries. Even war bands paused their marches when passing near these groves, lowering their weapons in respect. The Illyrians believed that spirits dwelled in the rustling leaves, ancestral, elemental, or divine, and that disturbing the grove angered them. Priestesses ensured these spaces remained untouched, conducting purification rituals whenever outsiders came too close. Another important sacred space was the cave. Illyrian priestesses often travelled into deep caverns to perform rites, especially when seeking visions or communicating with ancestors. Caves echoed with eerie clarity, making whispered chants multiply into haunting, layered harmonies. To the Illyrians, this was not mere acoustics. It was the voices of spirits answering back. Within these caverns, priestesses lit small fires or torches, watching the shadows flicker along the walls. The movement of those shadows, like smoke or wind, became part of their divination methods. Flowing water also held great spiritual significance. Springs and mountain streams were believed to be gateways to healing spirits. Many rituals involving illness or purification took place beside these waters. Priestesses washed ceremonial objects, cleansed participants, and interpreted the patterns of floating leaves or ripples. Some springs were so sacred that warriors refused to drink from them without a priestess's blessing. But not every sacred space was open to all. Forbidden zones existed, secluded shrines deep within forests or high on cliffs that only priestesses could enter. These places housed ancestral relics, symbolic stones, or ritual altars. Violating these boundaries was considered one of the gravest offences. Legends told of hunters who crossed into forbidden spaces and returned home cursed with misfortune, plagued by nightmares, or struck with sudden sickness. Whether superstition or reality, these stories kept the spaces safe. These sacred landscapes formed the spiritual map of Illyrian life. They shaped rituals, guided migrations, and offered a constant reminder that nature inhabited the same spiritual hierarchy as gods and ancestors. And it was the priestesses who navigated these realms, ensuring that every tribe remained in harmony with the forces that watched over them. Every Illyrian priestess carried with her a collection of sacred objects, items believed to hold protective power, ancestral memory, or divine energy. These talismans were not decorative. They were tools, companions, and in many cases, extensions of the priestess's authority. Each object had its own history and purpose, crafted through ritual and maintained through constant spiritual care. Together, they reflected the deeply symbolic worldview of Illyrian society. One of the most important items was the spirit knot, a woven cord made of wool or flax, often dyed in earthy tones. Priestesses used these cords during rituals involving fate, oaths, or emotional healing. By tying or untying knots in specific patterns, they symbolically bound or released energies, emotions, or ancestral obligations. A tightly knotted cord could represent protection, while a cord slowly unwrapped signified the softening of conflict. People often kept these knots as charms, believing they carried the priestess's blessing. Another essential object was the herbal satchel, a small leather pouch filled with dried plants, roots, and powders. Each herb had meaning. Juniper symbolized purification, thyme represented clarity, mugwort invoked visionary dreams, and yarrow protected warriors in battle. Before rituals, the priestess might pinch a small mixture from her pouch and cast it into a fire, letting the rising smoke carry prayers to the spirits. A single plant, chosen carefully, could alter the meaning of the ceremony. The bone talisman held deeper ancestral significance. Typically shaped from deer, wolf, or boar bone, these charms were carved with spirals, sun symbols, waves, or geometric patterns. Spirals symbolized the cycle of life and rebirth. Waves represented communication with other realms. Triangles invoked female energy and divine insight. These bone pieces were passed down from priestess to priestess, accumulating power through generations. Some were said to contain the essence of the first priestesses who had lived centuries earlier. Priestesses also used sacred bowls, often carved from stone or shaped from clay. These bowls held water during purification ceremonies, or glowed with burning embers during trance work. The patterns painted on them, zigzags, circles, or animal motifs, enhanced their symbolic potency. When a priestess circled a bowl around a sick person, water rippling in the firelight, the tribe believed the bowl itself whispered guidance from the spirits. Feathers, too, played an important role. Eagle feathers symbolized courage. Owl feathers represented wisdom and the night. Raven feathers were tied to messages from the ancestors. Worn in the hair, or tucked into belts, these feathers signaled a priestess's current spiritual task. These objects were never random trinkets. They were conduits connecting earth, sky, and spirit. When a priestess stepped into ritual space adorned with these sacred tools, she wasn't just a woman. She was the living bridge between the Illyrians and the invisible world guiding them. When the classical world collided with Illyria, through Greek colonists, Macedonian kings, and eventually Roman expansion, much of Illyrian culture changed forever. Yet the memory of the priestesses remained embedded in the mountains, stories, and traditions of the land. Their influence did not vanish. It transformed, echoing through centuries like a quiet heartbeat beneath layers of new beliefs. The legacy of the Illyrian priestesses became a hidden thread running through Balkan folklore, spirituality, and cultural identity. As Roman rule tightened across the region, sacred groves were cleared or repurposed, ancestral altars dismantled, and tribal political structures replaced by foreign administration. But spiritual traditions are not easily erased. Rural communities continued to honor old customs in secret. Women, often mothers, midwives, and herbalists, preserved fragments of priestess wisdom, passing them down quietly through generations. The knowledge of healing herbs endured in mountain villages. Rituals involving smoke, fire, and water survived disguised as folk traditions. And stories of wise women with visionary powers found new life as legends. Folklore across the Balkans still carries shadows of these ancient figures. Tales of women who interpret the wind, who speak to ancestors in dreams, or who can calm storms with chants, hint at the priestesses who once held formal authority. Even the concept of zanas, or mountain nymphs in later mythology, may preserve the memory of priestesses who lived close to sacred landscapes and wielded supernatural influence. These echoes remind us that powerful women once shaped the spiritual and political life of Illyrian tribes. The priestess traditions also left an imprint on cultural identity. Their rituals emphasized harmony between humans and nature, a relationship still seen in rural communities where trees, springs, and mountains are treated with quiet reverence. The belief that certain places hold unique spiritual energy persists, as does the idea that ancestors remain present, offering protection and guidance. These values survived foreign conquest, religious shifts, and centuries of change. Modern archaeology has begun revealing physical traces of these traditions: carved bone talismans, cave altars blackened with ancient smoke, and jewellery believed to belong to ritual specialists. These findings validate the stories passed down orally, proof that Illyrian priestesses once existed not only in myth, but in daily life. Their true legacy, however, lies in the enduring respect for intuitive wisdom, healing knowledge, and the sacred power of women. The priestesses of Illyria may no longer stand in groves or chant beside sacred fires, but their spirit lives on in the cultural memory of the region. In every story of a wise woman, in every ceremony honouring ancestors, and in every mountain spring thought to hold protective power, a fragment of the old priestesses still speaks, reminding us of a world where women guided tribes not through force, but through insight, tradition, and the voice of the divine carried on wind and flame.